Groat, an Indigenous historian at Western University. Good morning. Thanks so much for being with us. How do current concerns about Bill C-5 echo some of the past conflicts between First Nations and the federal government?
I think what we're seeing here is a continued pattern of lack of consultation. Now, Prime Minister Carney, in the clip you just showed, said that he's willing to listen today. But what a lot of First Nations chiefs are saying is that he should have listened before this bill was passed through Parliament and before it received royal assent. Now that the bill is already in place, I think there's a lot of concern that this consultation is going to be quite performative and that it's not really going to encourage any change. And we know that Prime Minister Carney was really looking to pass this legislation as fast as possible. And I think he was quite strategic in that plan because that could then engage in this consultation that might be less substantive than it might have been before the legislation was passed.
So from the outset this morning in his opening remarks, he emphasized partnership, and whatever was going to be done with Indigenous leaders, and that there would be shared benefits for First Nations communities. How can the Prime Minister establish trust with leaders during this meeting today?
I think it's going to be tricky to establish trust because I think the mindset going into this meeting with a lot of these elected chiefs is that that trust should have been established when the legislation was being developed. The legislation should have been a collaborative effort, and it really wasn't. It was quite rushed through to receive royal assent in the House and in the Senate, and there was limited consultation as the law was being developed. I really think Carney was intentional in that. And I really think that a lot of the leaders who are at this meeting today think that this is kind of a retroactive process of establishing trust, that maybe that trust might be difficult to establish at this point. I still think there's definitely a place. I do think that the Prime Minister wants to find a way to navigate these competing demands of development projects, energy corridors with Indigenous engagement. But I think he's going to see that the way he approached this legislation from the beginning really was seen as detrimental to a lot of First Nations interests, or at least counter to First Nations interests.
A number of Indigenous leaders have said, you know, we're not anti-development. That's certainly not our position. We just want more consultation. How achievable is a consensus between First Nations leaders and the government coming out of today's summit?
I think consensus is going to be really hard to come by. And one thing that really stood out to me in that clip that you just played of the Prime Minister is how a lot of elected chiefs are present. And I think there's competing demands, or I know there's competing demands between the interests of elected chiefs and the interests of hereditary governments. Now, for a lot of these pipelines and energy corridors, some of the biggest protests were hereditary governments instead of elected governments, which a lot of elected Indigenous governments are more keen to explore these energy projects than perhaps hereditary governments. And that's who's at the table today, those elected governments. They're going to have a lot of say. They're going to really push for, I think, nuanced discussions. But at the end of the day, there is other voices in First Nations across the country and Inuit and Métis communities who are different than the voices at the table with the Prime Minister.
Which also presents a challenge. Cody Groat, he's an Indigenous historian at Western University. Thanks so much, Cody. Glad you could join us.
Thank you for having me.